Hey folks, Zach Osterman here, IU Insider, Indianapolis Star. This is your Friday rundown for October 20th. We are coming up on Halloween, I suppose, but what I think everyone had in mind for today and what delayed the taping of this video until now was Boogie Fland's announcement. The five-star guard from Archbishop Stepinac out in White Plains, New York, was picking between IU, Kentucky, and Alabama. Word kind of got out last night. And so I don't think it was any surprise to anyone when Flan committed to Kentucky, but we wanted to wait until that news was official. I guess I wanted to wait. There's nobody else here. Until that news was official to just kind of, shoot this video and talk about that. And then we'll talk about 3 keys to Rutgers. I think that the big sort of talking point around this and around really just kind of where Indiana's wound up in these last, few weeks of the 2024 fall cycle has been that Mike Woodson and his staff, by choice, by design, swung a heavy bat in 2024. They were very picky. They tried very hard to be, involved with top guys. You obviously look at the 3 that kind of they've come down to the wire with here. Liam McNeely, who picked Indiana last weekend over Kansas. Flan, who obviously picked Kentucky over IU and Alabama. And then Derek Queen, who will take as a Maryland official this weekend. But even, you look beyond them to, Austin Swartz or Asa Noel or Jaden Mustaf or Curtis Givens, whoever. Indiana has tried to be very, very choosy in this class. And, the risk reward of that is always that if you can get those players, then you're going to wind up with some really, really good ones. If you can't, then you're not going to leave yourself a lot of options. And when you're competing at that top end, you're going to lose some recruitments. You just don't get to win every single one. Indiana loses to Kentucky here. Indiana just beat Kansas to 2 5-star recruits in the last 6 months. The kind of the point here is not necessarily to say that Indiana is worse than Kentucky and better than Kansas, but simply to say that when you are recruiting at this level, no matter who you are, no matter what your recent record or the prestige of your program or whatever, you're going to lose some. You just are. And Indiana is now in a position where obviously it landed Liam McNeely. That was a very important addition for the Hoosiers in 2024. But Boogie Fland is, of course, moving on, not moving on, but going elsewhere to Kentucky. And that's kind of left Indiana in a position where there's not an obvious next step in recruiting that sort of lead guard playmaker that Fland would have been almost immediately, next summer, next fall for Indiana. I think probably the best guess at this point is Indiana will wait until the spring, see if anything shakes loose in terms of, we've seen Indiana successfully recruit guys like Tamar Bates, Malik Renew, Mackenzie Mbako. It's been about 1 a year of guys that reopen their recruitments in the spring. Obviously, Indiana's also had success pulling that kind of player out of the portal with Xavier Johnson, and you've got Gabe Cupps, who's going to be a freshman this year. He'll be a sophomore next season. So there's at least a certain, that you've got a certain level of experience. You've got a certain level of sort of institutional depth and strength that you should be able to lean on even as you try to add somebody else kind of in that role that can, bring maybe some dynamism, just some different sort of, some different qualities and maybe pair well with Cubs, frankly, long term. So this is kind of it's a loss for Indiana, no doubt. On the other hand, I think, Mike Woodson would say, and I think he'd be right to say that doesn't mean Indiana shouldn't have tried. That ultimately, if you look at 24/7 Sports list of Indiana's all-time commitments, signees, recruits, whatever word you want to use, it's an incomplete list because for some reason DJ White is on it, but Eric Gordon is not. But it does seem to go backward a little bit in terms. It tries to go backward, to maybe the beginning of the rankings era. Again, Eric Gordon should be somewhere on that list, and he's not. But if you look at that list as constituted, 5 of the top 10 players on that list, Mike Woodson recruited. And that's Mbako, McNeely, Jalen Hood-Schifino, Malik Renew, Tamar Bates. And so, not every one of those guys works out, obviously. Tamar Bates wound up transferring. Jalen Hood-Schifino's in the NBA. That's just the nature of recruiting and developing young players. But the point is, if you're Indiana, you can't shy away from those kinds of recruitments, and you can't find reasons, as sometimes it has felt a little bit like Indiana has in the past, to not want to get involved. Again, if you talk about those 5 commitments, not one of them's from Indiana. Not one of them even really had a strong link to Indiana. It's not like they had a relative that went to IU or they grew up in Indianapolis but moved somewhere else. Renew was from Florida, Bates was from Kansas City, Hutchafina was from Pittsburgh, Mbaka was from New Jersey, McNeely is from Texas. They've all played, most of them played at kind of away from home at prep schools as well. The point is, if you're Indiana, you need to be trying to swim in that pond, and every once in a while you're going to sink, but it's better than just sort of not trying to flex your muscle and build that sort of reputation as a program that can serve players of that caliber well in college on their road potentially to the NBA, and obviously trying to win a lot of games between their commitment and whenever they do decide to declare for the draft or move on to the next level. So it's a blow for Indiana. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, I don't know that I think I would understand the motivations behind Indiana's pursuit of not just pursuit of Boogie Fland, who's a really good player, but also just sort of Indiana's approach in 2024. And I'm not sure the approach is wrong, even if you have to acknowledge that it's not always going to yield perfect results, if that makes sense. And I don't think Indiana should necessarily deviate from that approach, just because it absorbs one or two, tough beats. So, very quickly, the three keys to tomorrow's game against Rutgers. Indiana hosting Rutgers, noon, kickoff October 21st, Saturday. Homecoming, obviously, and I wrote about this, in the paper today. Indiana's 2-4. Penn State next weekend on the road, then Wisconsin at home. Two teams with designs on potentially winning their respective divisions in the Big Ten. If you lose this game, if you're Indiana, it is not hard to see, basically your bowl ambitions taken mathematically off the table by the end of week 9 or week 10, if you want to count the bye. This game is crucial for Indiana to be able to get to the other side of Penn State and Wisconsin and still have a path to bowl eligibility. Indiana is one of the 4 teams in the bottom 2 spots of the East and the West divisions. The other 3 teams, Illinois, Michigan State, Purdue. Indiana plays at Illinois, then hosts Michigan State, then plays at Purdue. That's Indiana's final 3 weeks. If you can win this game against Rutgers, then you leave that path open. If you can't, then there's really no opportunity to maybe capitalize on trying to feast on a relatively, I don't want to say easy, because Indiana itself has struggled mightily this season, but a potentially more manageable back end of the schedule, sort of final quarter of the schedule, if you want to say. It's not really a key so much as it's just got to be there. Indiana has to have a sense of urgency about this game. I mean, you have to have a sense of urgency probably about every game, but Indiana needs to see this as a must-win. And I know coaches don't like to talk about that. I know coaches like to say that, you treat every game the same, take every day as it is, and I understand that. But there are some games where you need to recognize that if you want to achieve what you think you're capable of achieving, if you are still the sort of team that can pull together as one and sort of raise your collective game, this is the kind of game where you need to do it. Rutgers is 5-2. On the other hand, the Scarlet Knights, I mean, they deserve to be where they are, but they aren't, a behemoth by any means. They don't score a ton of points, but they also don't allow a ton of points. So I guess the first of the 3 keys then is basically when I say clock management, what I mean is this feels like the sort of game that could be, I think my prediction for this game was a 21-20 Indiana win. It feels like the sort of game where neither team's going to get more than 3 or 4 scores. If it does, if either of these teams scores more than, let's say, 4 touchdowns, I would feel confident right now saying that team is likely going to win the game. I would be surprised if this is the sort of game where a team can score 4 times, and I'm not talking about field goals, I'm talking about touchdowns, and not win. I think it's going to be a lower scoring game. These are 2 of the top 5 teams in the conference in time of possession, average time of possession, and that's, some people think that's kind of an unwieldy number, and I'm sort of with them, but I think it's still, when you talk about Indiana's offensive struggles, when you talk about how much Rutgers is committed to running the football, I don't think it's an irrelevant stat for this game specifically. This is the kind of game where I think if one team can get ahead by 10, 14 points, then especially remembering the new clock rules for this season, that I think teams are just now starting to kind of get used to, I think that game can start to feel like it's shortening rapidly. Now, Rutgers, to be fair, overcame an 18-point deficit late against Michigan State last weekend. On the other hand, they were down 18, 24-6 at home to Michigan State, not a very good team. So that's kind of the the turnabout, I guess, a little bit, or the yin and the yang of this game is you've got a Rutgers team that's going to be coming in feeling good after the comeback win against Michigan State, but also a Rutgers team that was vulnerable enough to be down 18 at home against Michigan State. I think the first key for me is going to be, can one of these teams get to a place where its offense is operating efficiently enough and methodically enough and scoring enough to feel like maybe even if it's a low-scoring game, one team is kind of controlling the clock and controlling the game through just how much they're able, once they get ahead, to shorten it with time of possession and long, steady, consistent drives. Number two, therefore, is the run games. Rutgers runs the ball, I want to say, really well. They are one of the better teams in the conference in plays of 10-plus yards, 10-plus rushing plays of 10-plus yards, I should say. They do not throw it very much at all. They are not a prolific passing team. They have not been most of the season. Gavin Wimsatt, their quarterback, has had a couple good days passing the ball, but Rutgers' strength is running the football, even through Wimsatt. He's not necessarily a player like DJ Irons, who obviously the Akron quarterback who hurt Indiana. With his legs, it's worth saying that Akron's offense was designed very much around DJ Irons' mobility and his ability to hurt teams with his scrambling and with his sort of dual threat presence. If you're Rutgers, you might look at, frankly, a game like that and think, can we build some of that into our game plan? If Indiana seems to be struggling with it against a lesser opponent, could we maybe capitalize on some of that? But Rutgers isn't going to dramatically alter what it does, certainly not on the road, even against a team that's 2-4. So I think really, on Rutgers' side, they're going to commit to running the football the way they have a lot of this season. A lot of what they might try to do in the pass game can be opened up by that run game if you can't contain it. On the other hand, if you can, then you can put a passing game that isn't necessarily used to tearing off big chunks of yardage consistently into some second and longs, some third and longs, and that allows you to, A, shorten those Rutgers drives, and B, maybe force a Rutgers team that only has 7 turnovers this season. That's one of the lower numbers in the conference. Maybe force that Rutgers offense into a few mistakes, some tackles for loss, maybe some turnovers that give you short fields and make life easier on your offense. Indiana, on the other hand, I think we're still kind of figuring out what Indiana wants to be under Rod Carey. I thought we saw some clever sort of run-pass mix against Michigan in the first half before obviously that game really got away from Indiana in the second. What is interesting is based on Tom Allen's comments earlier this week, it does sound like Indiana's hopeful it will have Josh Henderson and Christian Turner both available. Those are the two guys that we kind of consider more of your kind of consistent every down backs. Jalen Lucas is much more of kind of an all-purpose player. Sometimes you'll run him into the line. Sometimes you'll flex him out. Sometimes you'll get him the ball in space. Sometimes you want to do some stuff option-wise to try and give him some the ability to get to the edge quickly. But Turner and Henderson, Indiana hasn't had both those guys healthy, I think, since week 2. I don't think Henderson was healthy for the Louisville game. If he was healthy for Louisville, he wasn't healthy for Akron. And so the point is it's been really at least a month since you had both of those guys, two experienced sort of consistent every down backs, that maybe if you are trying to build a ground game that is a little bit more sort of about efficiency and that commitment to kind of just staying on schedule, staying in good down and distance situations, making life easier for whoever your quarterback is. And quarterback will not be one of the keys to this game because, quite frankly, at this point, I'm just kind of tired of talking about this constant merry-go-round Indiana can't seem to get itself off of, which it clearly needs to at quarterback. But I think that from Rutgers' perspective, the run game is the quote-unquote second key here is going to be important because that's, I think, the way that the Scarlet Knights will want to win a game like this is by establishing the run and then letting everything else sort of branch out from there, whether it's the pass game, whether it's the way they control the clock, whether it's the way they score the ball, whatever it might be. From Indiana's perspective, this might be your best chance at kind of getting some of the health back in your run game that maybe has been patchy for the last few weeks. And on the other hand, this is a Rutgers team, again, that doesn't score a ton. If you can put them in a little bit of bother on the scoreboard, then, maybe you can get them out of that rhythm and suddenly maybe you're able to control the game a little bit more with your ability to run the ball, to eat up some, chew up some clock, eat up some first downs, shorten the game and make Rutgers feel uncomfortable. The last thing I would say is this is kind of a vague thing, but big plays. If you look at Rutgers numbers, and I'll literally just pull this up like while I'm doing this, and you can tell I'm super prepared for this. Forgive me. It is Friday afternoon. Rutgers hasn't scored more than 27 points, I think, in a month. They had 35 in a win over Virginia Tech, but they had 7. I guess they scored 52 against Wagner, but against, in their last 3 Big Ten games, they've scored 27 points. And again, they only had 6 points somewhere, I think, late in the third quarter of that game. They had 13 against Wisconsin. They had 7 against Michigan. They're not a high-scoring offense necessarily. And I think one of those, if I'm not mistaken, one of those Rutgers touchdowns against Michigan State was a muffed punt that was recovered in the end zone for a touchdown. So the point is, when I say big plays, that's kind of what I'm talking about. This is the sort of game where it does feel a little bit too like, a kickoff return for a touchdown, a punt return for a touchdown. I mentioned Rutgers turnover numbers. They've only lost 7 turnovers all season, 3 fumbles, 4 interceptions. If you can force them into 1 or 2 mistakes like that in a game that's not likely to be high scoring, at least based on what we can see of these teams on paper right now, the potential to create some sort of what I think coaches tend to call sudden change situations where maybe you get a turnover that leads to a quick touchdown, or again you get a special teams touchdown, something like that. That is always important. Coaches will always tell you they love those things, but I think in a game like this, that sort of thing is going to be worth its weight in gold. Indiana, it's worth saying, has also been pretty good with turnovers. They've lost 9 this year. Obviously, a bunch of those came in the Michigan game, and most defenses, including Rutgers, are not Michigan's defense. So prior to that game, Indiana had been pretty solid in terms of ball security. Indiana's got 6 picks this year, which is a pretty decent number. They have no fumbles recovered. And in a game, again, where I don't think we're really expecting bad weather for it in Bloomington, but you've got a team that might run the ball quite a bit. If you could find your way to force in a fumble or 2, that would go a long way. I just think when you talk about low-scoring games, and we don't, it feels like in modern college football we talk so much about wide-open offenses and, just the offensive evolution and scoring and things like that. You don't come into a ton of games, maybe that don't involve Iowa, frankly, where you expect that, the scoring numbers to be really low. But this is the sort of game that you wouldn't have trouble convincing me it's a 20-17, or again, I think my final prediction was 21-20 Indiana. In a game like that, if you can even score 1 touchdown on special teams or something of that nature, that is huge. And so I think that's kind of that third key that I'd be looking at is, can one of these teams pull a couple really big plays out of nothing, or score a touchdown, via a slightly less conventional means. I think that would be really substantial in how it might impact the final score of this game. So it does feel a little bit like a bit of a last stand for Indiana, frankly, in this season. It's the kind of game I think you need to win to keep your season on a certain track. But on the other hand, if you can win it, again, you give yourself that window to potentially get to those final 3 games of the season and say, we're still in control of our destiny. And, if we can find our way to winning these last 3, then we can still realize what would have been a baseline goal for the season. So Hoosiers kick off against Rutgers at noon Saturday at Memorial Stadium in Bloomington. We will be there, but between now and then for the Indianapolis Star. This has been a slightly longer Friday rundown. Forgive me, but we had a lot to talk about. I'm Zach Osterman. Thank you so much for watching. We'll talk to you soon.